So don't be worried about people leaving. It might be a little bit, no, some of it might be linked to the English, which is the case in the Francophone world. I had to get used to it, but it's really the case. And if people don't understand anything, I can sort of understand why they would leave. Go outside.
Yeah.
Anyway, John Tresch. I've known John Tresch not very well, but for ages. I think we met at the Max Planck Institute approximately
2 or 3 decades ago.
Yeah, two decades ago.
Max.
But then he was a postdoc, I guess. Now he is a professor at the Warburg Institute in London. He's at the same time an anthropologist and a historian, I think, but more of a historian of science, and he has published 2 books, I think. The Romantic Machine is one of them, and the other one is called Edgar Allan Poe and the Forging of American Science. And he's working on, or maybe it's already sent to the editor, on a project that is called Cosmograms. And I saw him again a little while ago, but then also we discovered a great interview he did actually with Bruno Latour, I think just some months before the inquiry was first published. So I'm really happy that you are here.
Thank you.
And the floor is yours.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to be here. Thanks for staying. I will speak in English. Je peux répondre aux questions en français si vous voulez, so maybe vous pouvez rester jusqu'à la fin si vous voulez. Mais je vais essayer d'aller assez lentement en anglais pour ceux qui ne sont pas anglophones. My talk, thank you so much for the introduction, Catherine and Didier, for the 2 of you for the invitation. My talk is about 2 important notions in Bruno's work. Big notions, ontology and composition, or compositionism. And ontology is there all along. Compositionism is there in and out of focus in the 2000s and 2010s. The question is how these 2 strands interact. Both are present in the enquête, enquête into modes of existence, which he defines as a more systematic way of accounting for the various ontological templates of those who have never been modern. And the term composition shows up a few times in the book as well. I think the book is an exercise and an exemplification of composition. We'll see whether you agree. I'm asking how these 2 series relate, especially in terms of where they bring us now in relation to his later work, which was responding to the new climatic regime and all of the crises, the polycrisis that has unfolded along with it. And here, thinking about how to update the inquiry, I'm very indebted to Isabelle Stenger's essay in the edition of Theory and Culture and Society, edited by Antoine Hénion, where she asks, how do we move pragmatically from the moderns to the contemporaries, building on the inquiry, the enquête. She reminds us that we should not too quickly multiply the number of modes that we're using, and then she goes on to multiply them. She adds 2 new ones, or at least proposes them, in the light of the new climatic regime. The first would be a mode which deals with critical zones science, which don't have the same regime of distance, remoteness, and objective search for explanation or cause that REF does. So CZN might be a new mode. The second is engenderment, or generation, the term that he introduces and the problem that Bruno introduced in Down to Earth, or Où atterrir. The question of how do we create forms of life such that they can reproduce themselves, that they can continue into a future which is uncertain. How do you think generationally? So that might be another mode of existence. So following her lead, taking the permission that she grants to test other possible modes, I want to simply ask whether composition might be a mode of existence. COM, for example, or I don't know, CPN. I'm not so concerned whether the answer is yes or no. I just want to use this as a way to explicate Bruno's work and move it further. But it does seem like a relevant question, particularly in thinking about the inquiry, because it seems that the inquiry itself, which I see as a project of composition, doesn't have a mode, doesn't define a mode to explain what it's doing. There is no mode that explains the kind of work that Bruno is doing in that book, or perhaps more generally, similar projects where he attempted to describe, define, juxtapose, interrogate, and eventually institute not one mode of being, but a whole ensemble of modes of being to make sense for one form of life. In the inquiry, it was for the West, or to introduce it to the non-West, the others, which was the happy scenography, the optimistic scene that was the setting for the enquête. So that's a strange omission for a sociologist and philosopher who is so repeatedly reflexive in explaining the conditions of his own work, not to define the mode in the terms of the work that he's doing, of the thing that he is en train de faire. Perhaps this reflects a admirable discretion. We don't want to get lost again in the self-satisfied spirals of reflexivity. Science studies did that and has moved on. But it might also, I think, reflect his principled ambivalence towards notions of totality or holism, completeness. Totality was a bad word throughout the 20th century in philosophy, associated with Hegelianism, totalitarianism, mystical vagueness, idealism, reduction. But Latour is constantly drawing towards it and away from it, returning to it. And there are endless examples of him setting it aside. The list of terms for the modern in irréduction that he sets aside, those are unacceptable totalities, holistic terms. Likewise, when he refuses to define Gaia as a sphere, not to return to that Platonic idea of perfection and completeness, Gaia has to be open, undefined, incomplete. Even more resolutely in the introduction with Isabel Stengers to Surio's different modes of existence, they insist on Surio as an admirable philosopher against totality. Everything is a sketch, Surio says. Everywhere the to be made, the affaire, responds to the great truth of existential incompleteness. The world is not finished and never can be. At the same time, Bruno was breathtakingly open about the poignant relationship he had to totality in his late interviews on Arte, first filmed and then recently published as Habiter la Terre with Nicolas Truand. Philosophy is this amazing form, he says, that's interested in the totality but can never attain it. Interested but can never attain it. But perhaps the aim is not to attain it but to love it, he says. So wholes, totalities, unifications, cosmoi, the plural of the cosmos, a world in common. These are necessary notions, necessary concepts of bringing things together into a whole, and yet they're always incomplete. They're never realized. And I think this paradox, or essential instability, irresolutability, is crucial to the notion of compositionism, which is about building a whole, but a whole that can never finish. And I also think we can bring it out more clearly by reflecting on different versions of multiple ontologies, that slogan that ran throughout the humanities and social sciences for the last 20 years or so, often following Bruno's work, which are at play in his work too. So as an overview, in what follows, I have 3 sections: how many multiple ontologies, getting to grips with compositionism, and preview, to stick around, the galleries of superexistence, and I'll tell you what those are when we get there. The last section also touches on cosmograms, or representations of the universe as a whole. And this, sadly, is my terrain. this is the field that I've been working on, representations in many cultures, times, and places of the totality, the ways they're made, how they work, the effects that they have. The book will be called How to Do Things with Worlds, little pun on Austin, and it deals with, in a very open way, the kinds of objects that tell a story of the universe, that gather beings together and classify and rank them, put them in position in a totality in relation to each other, connect the divine and the human, join together earth, heaven, and humans and individuals, and also communicate specific values and virtues. As in this figure, the cosmological Enzo figure from Zen, which is an open circle expressing both tranquility, fullness, and emptiness, incompleteness at the same time. So Bruno liked the word cosmogram. There was a period when he was using it himself quite a lot, and he very directly encouraged me to develop it. I remember him in the halls of the CSI taking me aside and said, "You must write this book. The world needs it." I said, "Okay, Bruno, I will." But this is a little bit like Hamlet and the ghost of Hamlet's father with this command, because to be or not to be, I have not yet managed to live up to this burden. I've not yet fulfilled this duty, executed this command. So again, I'm very grateful for this opportunity to talk with all of you who know these materials, perhaps as a hope of letting go of this burden and moving on, moving it forward. Not to give it up, but to bring it to completion. And also with all of you to bring the work of our teacher and friend further along the path of instauration into more full and varied existence. So, simple question you might think, how many multiple ontologies? So this is a bit of recent history. The term ontology, much longer, means a discourse on being. It runs throughout Western philosophy, usually with the assumption that there's only one ontology, not multiple ontologies, one being, one world, one truth. We might see versions of a multiple ontology in various forms of dualism, two ontology, two modes of being, also in pluralism, in medieval debates about divine power and multiple worlds, even in Bachelard's regional epistemologies. But the modern discussions of this notion in those terms are all fairly recent. And in fact, they went a little crazy in the 2000s. Here's an engram tracking the rise and fall of ontologies after about 2017, a kind of peak and a hangover afterwards. It's kind of like tulip mania for academics, a kind of classic bubble. And an anthropologist I know says his students want to talk about ontologies, and he tells them just to leave it alone. Just don't touch it. It might take another generation. So me talking about multiple ontologies is a little bit like a accident investigation after a crash. Like, what happened? What was that all about? But it's still fairly recent and worth digging into. So what are the possible versions of multiplicity? The first we can call ontologies as wholes, and it directly is answering the classical philosophical question, which sees ontology as a single ground of being. But it multiplies it, and this is often anthropologists who do it, by showing that it is different in different collectivities. The most pertinent example is Descola, with his 4 responses to the question of being in the anthropological record: animism, totemism, analogism, and naturalism. Viveros de Castro likewise elaborated the astounding metaphysical construction of Amazonian perspectivalism, which in a way multiplied ontologies even more, as each species, jaguar, bird, or human, can be said to have its own ontology, to have its own world or theory of being. Latour's review of their debate, Perspectivism, Type or Bomb, helped set terms for later discussions. There was a celebrated panel in 2014 at the AAA, Anthropological Association. Holbrad and Peterson picked it up as a movement, as a turn. Basir and Bond denounced the movement. Viveros came back with a strong defense of anthropology of ontology. David Graeber answered Viveros' critique, laying out his lines, and by about 2015, everyone was exhausted. They've been debating ontology long enough. But the key point here is that this is a form of multiple ontologies of wholes. And the burning questions of these wholes concern radical alterity, the difference from one to the other, and the gap, the incommensurability between them. Is it commensurable or not? Is there a vantage point from which to compare Amazonian shamanism, Cuban witchcraft, Mongolian possession, and Parisian scientific research? Or are they distinct worlds with a divide which can only be crossed through falsifying and misrepresenting genuine difference? And the second version of multiple ontologies comes from science studies, which also around the same time was bringing it forward and kind of talking it out, debating it, notably with this collection in Social Studies of Science in 2013. But this is an ontologies, the one I'm interested in, an ontology of multiple ontologies of parts, and temporal parts in particular. The first is Bruno's own, although I think it's remarkable that into the 2000s, up into the 2000s, I don't think he uses ontology that much in his work. I'll have to go back and look much more closely, but the phrase multiple ontologies, if at all, is very rare, and ontology is mostly used by Bruno when he's distinguishing his view of the progressive making or construction of scientific facts from the standard philosophical view of science as the methodological and logical discovery of facts that exist before humans. So in this view, ontology is multiple in time. Is there a TRF in 62? There is a TRF. What is it? It's a peptide. It might not be a peptide. It is a peptide. It contains these elements. It is this. We now know what it is. So it's the movement by progressive slices from uncertainty to greater certainty to reality that defines the multiple ontologies that any being, especially those produced in labs, undergoes. So there's an ontological gradient, which is temporal, of increasing reality, where vague perceptions become a set of defined possibilities and only end at the end of a long process are real. A similar graded conception of ontology shows up in Pandora's Hope in 1997, moving from where it's qualified as a movement from local particular observations to universal generalities, but also from matter to form. And this seems very much to anticipate the process of instauration that he'll rediscover with Stengers in Suryo. And I find it interesting also because this diagram, because it actually recapitulates but turns on its side a very frequently repeated image in Neoplatonism of two intersecting triangles, one of the spirit intersecting matter. And all the action is right there in this lozenge between the two. This is where the whole human struggle plays out. Probably more to say on that, but I'll just leave it there. The third sense of multiple ontologies is in terms of methods or bodies of knowledge. This is also in STS, but often expressed with a medical or feminist emphasis. It also applies to the question of the life story of a fact. It brings that in, but focuses on the way in which different methods, subfields, and their practices have distinct theories of being. This is pronounced in Anne-Marie Mull's The Body Multiple, and I think she puts the term multiple ontology in widest circulation because this book exemplifies and theorizes it so clearly. Ontology is not given in the order of things. Ontologies are brought into being, sustained, or allowed to wither away. Ontology in practice is multiple, like pages in a sketchbook, each made with a different technique and a variable scale. There is no fixed point of comparison. So Moll and others, and this book was very influential, treat ontologies as distinct forms of expertise, bodies of knowledge, technological interventions, and even social domains like gender, the broader theories that run through a collective, each of which has their own theory of what is and is not. These were crucial sources for what I see as the fourth version of multiple ontologies, where we are now, ontologies as modes of existence. This is the inquiry with Latour's modes and passages, his felicity conditions and crossings, including what he calls the meta-modes of networks and prepositions, which align and work amongst the different modes. We are going to try, he says, to benefit from the plurality of the ontologies released from the crushing division of object and subject. For each type of being, we shall ask what specifications their ontology must respect, what are their essential requirements. So it is a manifesto of multiple ontologies. The fifth version is also very similar and is one of the inspirations for Latour, which is Surio's version of ontologies as modes of existence. Now, I don't want to go into detail, but there are three points to bring out in returning to Surio. First, a difference. Surio's modes are very different from Latour's modes of existence. He's not concerned, modes are not applied to particular roots of instauration, etc. There's not a law or religion or politics mode. Instead, they're concerned with different planes of being, phenomena which are just sensory arrangements, things which endure over time and unite many different phenomena, and those could be objects of science or encountered in the world, or souls, imaginary beings which require our care or solicitude, much like the beings of fiction, and even less substantially, virtuals, which are fragments calling out for completion in many forms. These different modes may be articulated and joined by what he calls synaptics, prepositions, forms of conjunction. They can also be considered not as sustained entities, but rather as events, as actions, so that you can read the entire series of existences either as substances, stable substances, or as events in a mode like Bergson or Heraclitus. These two approaches he presents as in dialectic in some points. The overall picture of reality, nevertheless, winds up being very similar, but what he calls a mode of existence is not the same kind of thing that Latour calls a mode of existence. But there is a similarity. So the second point is that the process of instauration, which Surio discusses, particularly with the work of art to be made, a little lecture that he gave after he wrote the main book, is directly appropriated by Latour, and quite faithfully. The sense of bringing beings into progressive definition and reality through practical work, and with the possibility of failure, with both the idea of the work to be made and the work to realize it changing through this encounter. And third, another similarity, which is, I think, important for composition. As I'll discuss below, the articulation of multiple modes is key to the whole system. Distinct modes, but how do you articulate them? For Surio, this is called surexistence. And now I'm translating that as superexistence because in the English version of Surio, they call it surexistence, I think because they don't want it to sound crazy. Superexistence sounds a little crazy, but it's directly lined up with the translations, which I think Surio intends, of le surhomme of Nietzsche or le surnaturel, the supernatural. So surhomme, surnaturel, surexistence, Superman, supernatural, superexistence. Why not? Let's go for it. And for Surio, superexistences are key to the whole system. They implicate plurimodal existence. All entities are an intersection of many different modes. There are pure existences, but they're extremely rare and maybe can't actually stay that way. And the complex combination among these different existences defines the world, defines things and defines the world. So more on that soon. So these are, but crucially, there are unifications and even unifications of unifications. And yet, as Stengers and Latour say in the introduction, there's a rejection of the notion of totality, of the whole that would flatten all those existential differences across the types of being, the modes of being, and the beings assembled out of them. There's a real lively difference among assembled beings. So, to start with, 5 versions of multiple ontologies, and all of these are feeding into the inquiry. The multiple versions of multiple ontologies that are picked up again in M. The notion of instauration from Suryo restates the idea of successive states of ontological reality in terms of time slices of ontology. Likewise, each mode is a particular form of speaking truly or falsely, as in the distinct ontological pages that Moll picks out. I also think it's worth noting, back to our timeline and the engram, that it's likely that the anthropologists' debate about radical alterity really influenced the gaps that Latour emphasizes between different modes and the ontologies that make up the whole system by the time he published it in the teens. This sense of radical difference between ontologies drives the presentation of modes of existence. So both Viveros de Castro and Descolas' debates about the gaps between different collectives and their ways of understanding being, but also Suryo's notion of the intensification of being, which I'll say more about in a second, in multimodal assemblage. Both of these are informing the understanding of the way in which the modes work together in the inquiry. So, on to composition. This emerges from discussions about cosmopolitics, and its slogan is the making of a world in common. Beyond that, it's actually pretty hard to pin down. He has 2 manifestos, but they're not really that clear as definitions. This is what composition is: a manifesto without 2 manifestos without a definition. The attempt at the Compositionist Manifesto from 2010 does say that composition starts by getting rid of the distinction between natural and constructed, replacing it with that between well and badly constructed. And this is in line with the modes. But otherwise, it's mainly connotations, and these are in the negative. Composition is not critique. It emerges from the ruins of naturalism. It has more in common with the 16th century and its vital and animistic forces than the 20th century and its inanimate nature. He evokes Descolas' 4 ontologies for quite some length. These underline agency as much as possible at each step, unlike naturalism, without any difference between humans and non-humans. So I see this first attempt at a manifesto, one of the key lessons is that he is presenting this as a historical and prophetic claim. Composition is the successor to the epoch and civilization that was defined by naturalism, that ambivalent modernity which we never really were. In short, he's adding to Descolas' scheme, suggesting compositionism as the 5th ontology. This highlights, I think, the extreme importance that he gave the concept, even if he doesn't define it extensively. So a second manifesto was given as a lecture for the opening of SPIP, the École des Arts Politiques at Sciences Po. This is strongly marked by James and Suryo. The world is a pluriverse. There is no common world, and yet the common world has to be composed, that central paradox. It's not buried in nature in a universal. It's not hidden under veils of ideologies. It has to be made, created, instaured, back to Suryo, and it can fail. This is the most robust discussion of composition. Effectively, for the interests of SPIP, this new research group and training program started at Sciences Po, he redefines it essentially as a merging of 2 modes in the inquiry, the artistic and the scientific. There will be research, investigations, and there will be works made with great eloquence and skill. Composing can mean to arrange, to make compromises, to combine, make combinations and deals, but to assemble, harmonize, and put to work. It's also a synonym for design. So this is an art school, among other things. This term is doubled in French as dessin and dessin, which sound identical to me. Dessiner le dessin, one with an I and one with an E. So as he says, we throw ourselves into the project of sketching the scheme of a world in common, a work which can always fail. Dessiner le dessin d'un monde en commun. So the frequent reference in this text to Suryo suggests that the plurality of worlds is also the plurality of modes. Each mode is its own plane or cosmos, and they're joined together and realized in new forms in what he calls political arts, combining both research and creation. The historical scheme that he sketches in both of these essays also shows up in 2018 in this essay in a Festschrift for Descola, Ce cheval ne tient plus dans le cadre, the horse doesn't stay in the frame. Here he claims to sketch a possible definition of composition, again, pretty sketchy, but they are revealing these lines. It's discussing a painting in Mantua, which is made around 1527 in a palace, in murals dedicated to Hercules. These display the Renaissance's emblematic and allegorical imagery, its webs of sympathies, correspondences between microcosm and macrocosm, exemplifying the deep conceptual link that Descola pointed out between Renaissance Europe and analogous regimes elsewhere, the Hindu cosmic person, the Chinese imperial city. Europe was analogous before it became naturalist, according to Descola. But one unusual panel gives a remarkably different picture. There is an extremely realistic image of a horse stepping out of the frame. This is the favorito of the Gonzaga prince. It's the horse of the man for whom the building was made, the painting was made. And he loves it and he wants a picture of his horse. The striking verisimilitude of the picture, according to Latour, anticipates the visual regime which a century later will become predominant, the world of matters of fact. The single frame of nature, material, mathematical and objective, a continuous res extensa, now discontinuous with the inner world of the thinking thing, the subjectivity, thought, and interpretation. So just as this horse is stepping out of the frame, we now, at the end of naturalism, are stepping out of the frame of what came before us. We are being set free from the frame of nature. There's a disintegration of naturalism underway, a cosmological revolution necessitated by the new climatic regime. In the sciences, he says this is already happening. Biology, chemistry, ecology, even quantum physics are discovering how much bodies are not separated from each other, but interlaced with their predecessors and their neighbors. These new scientific views destabilize the universe of Galileo and Descartes. But just as naturalism retained from analogism an attention to specific entities, even though it left behind the correspondences and sympathies, compositionism, this new regime, this new ontology, will also keep this sharp focus on beings, but without the assumption that they can be brought into, as point entities into a single unified plan of laws of nature. So science would then be a science without nature. Composition frees us from the frame, but brings with it a new task of organizing the interlacing of beings. This essay obviously resonates with Gaia and with critical zones, which also presuppose entangled, interdependent beings without the need for an abstract frame of pre-given space. The question remains, how will they be placed in order? How to construct the overlapping layers of institutional, legal, technical, and aesthetic reinforcement that can replace those of modern nature, the amalgam that gave everything a pre-made place. And second, what broader orientation or concept can take the place of that dismantled frame. I think that this is where Gaia steps in as the backdrop for this, the new backdrop for this multiplicity, this precise and defined multiplicity. If the sciences are redefining themselves by interlacing and interdependence at all levels, Gaia would be the new open ground for a science without nature, the backdrop, the empty and open backdrop for a composition that always has to be recomposed. One last point to draw out of this essay that I find particularly striking is the light that it sheds somewhat obliquely on his claims in We Have Never Been Modern. What it shows to me is that he really meant it. That the world the moderns thought they lived in, where there's one of purification between subjects and objects, and one which they're not so clearly aware of, but is shaping their experience, which is real, of hybrids and networks, are both present at the same time. We actually live, when we were modern, in two ontologies, in a super existence of two ontologies. However, they are badly composed. These two modes of ontology are badly composed. This is not just a way of speaking for a single world that is coherent. Rather, there's a specific and coherent form of the incoherence of ontology, of the ontology of the moderns. Two distinct ontologies, especially when you see this one as coming directly from the analogism which preceded it in the essay on the horse. So modernity was already a hybrid, multimodal, a superexistence. So to summarize where we are with compositionism, starting point, there is no world in common given by nature. Rather, it's a world in common to be made, a world à faire in the language of Souriau. Composition artfully articulates radically opposed elements across an ontological gap which can be narrower or greater, but potentially actually incommensurable, incompossible, non-compossible. Different modes of beings, mode of instauration, and ontologies. And I think there's another point to draw from Souriau here, particularly as Souriau himself uses the term composition to describe superexistences. So another aspect of superexistences that is particularly visible in the last pages of the work on the different modes, and in the work on the work of art to make, is that the joining together of multiple modes of existences, in some sense, if it's well done, heightens the particularity, the reality, the intensity, the pituity, he calls it, of each of those modes. By joining them together, it's not a loss, but rather turning up the volume, turning up the saturation, turning up the color of each of the elements that are joined together. The ontologies are not flattened, but intensified through superposition, through putting them together in articulated forms. Virtuals and imaginaries are progressively instaured as things, situations, localities, and worlds get worlded. The intensity of pure existences depends on the plurality of the modes. So these intensities are heightened by the juxtaposition, and for this reason, also, they're never finished. The work of composition is never finished. If they become even more distinct from each other, even more intensely other, different existences that are brought together, further stages of composition are going to be necessary to deal with the new realities and intensities that are unleashed by every new articulation. This is a reason for the incompleteness of being and of composition. So a quick side note, a critique that has been brought against Latour and Stenger's understanding of a search for a world in common by two great anthropologists, Mario Blazer and Marisol de la Cadena. So they are in general aligned with the idea of building a world in common. They're both interested in ecological politics as it plays out in indigenous communities, as those communities engage with multinationals, with local agencies, government agencies, with sciences of various sorts. But they want to insist on the radical differences of a caribou understood by a game, someone who's taking the population of game as an ecologist, and a caribou as understood as Atiku, a sacred being controlled by the master of the forest who needs to be ritually taken care of even as you hunt it and bury its bones. The same being understood different ways, not reconcilable in any simple way. Likewise, de la Cadena talks about a mountain which is alive, a god of sorts, which is also a mountain understood by mining experts as a store of metals. These cannot be assimilated into a common world. They're two different things. So it's a very important point, bringing out the gap, the ontological gap between different modes of existence. However, I think the route that I've just traced from multiple ontologies and the influence of Souriau on the modes of existence shows that this sense of very different kinds of ontology is already there in the modes, with very significant gaps, at least if they're well made, if the connections are well made. Those gaps are preserved, the intensity of each is still preserved without reducing one into the other. The critique made by these authors, I think, is also useful in returning us to settings where the question of relations between the West and the rest, as is the scenography of modes of existence, comes back to mind, is brought back to mind. Because it's there at the start of modes, it's there at the end, but the non-modern others to whom the book is addressed are pretty vaguely sketched in that book. And often in a lot of Latour's works, they're assumed to be a certain way. For instance, they have networks, they don't have subjects and objects, but he leaves the detailed ethnography to his friends. Fair enough. He had a lot on his plate. He had a lot to do. But I think it raises an important point for what AIME was about, and also I think ways that we can continue it, ways that we can push it further. So to go back to Stengers, she reminds us about this recent essay. She reminds us about this happy fiction of a diplomatic encounter between the West and the rest of the world, which of course is restating scenography in We Have Never Been Modern. How does the West present itself to the rest of the world? And especially the radical difference assumed between us and them. Now, the inquiry is very explicit in preparing for such an encounter, but with an improved understanding of what we are for us for us, and also what we will be for them. Here, rather than two divisions, two modes, we have the 15 modes and all of the links that they form between them, all the crosses they form between them. This is a refined, improved, clarified understanding, open for debate, open for investigation, but better than the two big divides, the one single divide between two modes of being in modernity. But I think it's worth pointing out that the others also have other modes, right? They're not just in a blur of everything being all the same. They also have divisions as simple as the sacred and profane, but also much more complex than that, between magical, priestly, and mundane domains. Roy Wagner and Marilyn Strathern point out how different modes of relation can be foregrounded and backgrounded in different contexts in Melanesia, right? Two different modes of being that alternate in different settings. Leach's Highland Burma, his ethnography of Highland Burma shows alternations between strict hierarchy and loose egalitarianism in different political settings, which is like the modal alternations between winter and summer that Marcel Mauss talked about in Inuit societies. So outside of the West, there is also multimodality. Recognizing the presence of distinct modes of existence in every collective lets us recognize also the ways in which those modes can go in to contribute to the West, to modernity. Ideas of federation borrowed by English settlers from the Iroquois, yoga, ayahuasca therapy, conceptions of God borrowed by Christians from Muslim predecessors, as well as styles of music, art, worship, and political leadership that are ingested from former colonies. Some of these are just styles or forms, but others possess the robustness of an instaured mode of existence and demand the proper felicity conditions to be well made and well instaured, whether outside modernity or within modernity, if we can even draw a line between these two in such an intermixed situation with so many crossings. On the other hand, this point highlights the intricate interactions and frictions between Western science, modern politics, and economic reckoning, which are also found now within all non-Western worlds. Even if they're rooted in devotion to the ancestors, animal kin, and the earth, they operate in pervasive interaction with Western science, policies, economics. They engage with cell phones and drug trials, development initiatives, and WHO interventions, even as they observe rights for the ancestors and the earth. So any potential for a genuine composition from a planetary perspective for the new climatic regime, which is planetary, is going to have to conceive of a composition which engages the West along with the rest of the world. It can't limit itself to clearing up what modernity was or is all about. This is like in Stenger's Cosmopolitical Manifesto. It has to ensure that all affected by future decisions are party to the negotiation. And her more recent suggestion on new modes, one for critical zone sciences, as I mentioned, one for engendering, also enriched this take on composition by thinking of a mode which would be engendering. Right? And this could be a mode that isn't at all proper to the moderns, but proper to this new planetary situation we're in. A distinct mode of instauration requiring care and discernment on the part of those who have to equip newcomers to make them capable not only of enduring, but of facing what those responsible for equipping them cannot foresee. Irreducibly collective practices that transmit to those to come a trust in their ability to participate in the making and composition of worlds. So, as you see, for Stenger's, composition is part of this new mode. She also uses the term when she describes critical zones science as a new mode. There's a strong affinity between engendering, as Bruno sketches it in Down to Earth, and as Stengers elaborates it, and this elusive practice or mode of composition. I also want to insist out of this detour that composition, therefore, is not only for those still to come, but also is happening in many places, in many different forms, for many different collectives, in various sites, variable sites of cosmic mapping. So there are many different kinds of superexistence, of totalities, incomplete, unfinished totalities, being made across the planet, intermodal assemblages of all kinds. And that's where we move into the possibility, the speculative game of galleries of superexistences. It would be worthwhile to compare the many different ways in which totalities, compositions, are composed, set together against each other in different moments and in different times, because this is the challenge of the present. How do we compose across those many different kinds of variability? A clear, although somewhat uncanny version is put out in James's What Pragmatism Means. This is the pragmatist hotel analogy. Pragmatism is like a corridor in a hotel. Innumerable chambers open out of it. In one, you find a man writing an atheistic volume. In the next, someone is on his knees praying. In the third, a chemist is investigating a body's properties. But they all own the corridor, all pass through it if they want a practical way of getting into or out of their respective rooms. So this is a gallery of distinct super existences. And it can be a little scary, right? You don't always know what's behind those doors, and you don't always want to know. Another example, if done well, of course, are international exhibitions of art, of science, of all kinds, gatherings like in ethnographic museums. They have the potential of flattening, but they also have the potential of bringing forward, making visible to each other, different ways of assembling worlds in common within a larger scale or a broader world in common, a more complex superexistence made of those superexistences. Another example which really resonates with all of the talks so far today, or certainly the last two, is Jean Rouche's film Les Maîtres Fous, which is The Crazy Masters, which can be read as a gallery of superexistences performed within a specific ritual setting of possession in Ghana in the 1950s by Songhay itinerant workers who successively worked through the multiple modes, educational, military, scientific, of European states in their particular mode of a possession ritual, while possessed by the teacher, the soldier, the colonial administrator. Another possibility to consider is the diplomatic compositions of the Qing court under the Qianlong emperor. This is the same person in each image, he deployed huge resources to show that he was an exemplary king, a scholar, a hunter, a wise ruler, but also in his garden of perfect brightness, a classical Chinese pleasure garden, he also collected and staged the worlds of his European visitors in miniature Western buildings that were full of clocks and tapestries. So the West is there along with the splendors of the Chinese Empire. He also produced, for his Tibetan subjects or members of the empire, tapestries like this, where he doesn't simply honor Tibet, but shows himself integrated into their cosmology, taking no less place than that of Manjushri, the Buddha, the enlightened being, but incorporating himself into this alternative way of composing a universe as part of his own complex composition, multimodal composition of superexistences. What a fun sentence to say. These are all galleries of superexistence, snapshots of multiple modes of being in which power plays and struggles for voice among different modes are unmissable, right? This is about power. Not every voice is heard. They're not all equally held there. But we can learn from them about possible conditions for worlds in common, maybe versions we haven't thought of, that don't take a single neutral form, but in which the forms and settings of composition are always changing and reforming, and where difference, we can at least hope, does not imply war. So for the challenges of the climatic regime that we're currently in, the particular question of the superexistences that we want to look at and compare are those that compose a pluriverse that contains science, ecological science, detecting the harms and possibilities within the critical zone, within the atmosphere, within the earth, but are not defined by science. How do we articulate a cosmos where science is part of it, but not the definition of it, a cosmos including science without a nature? And we know of many examples. The Make It Work program was an attempt to realize this. Frédéric's work with Alexandra Arendz and with Bruno to perform a gaiography to show not only the interactions of the Earth system, but humans' role in shaping that Earth system, our attempts to make visible this world in common where humans and non-humans are producing this composition. Another future-looking example, but also backward, is traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, which is addressed in books like the extremely popular Braiding Sweetgrass by a Potawatomi botanist, Robin Wall Kimmerer. At the end, she recalls the story of three sisters, corn, beans, and squash, which when you plant them together, each support each other and restore the soil cyclically, season after season. For her, this is a metaphor for weaving together indigenous knowledge and science within an ethical shared habitat, a common world. Another extremely compelling example, which has been taken up by the city of Amsterdam, is economist Kate Raworth's donut economics. It sounds tasty, and it is. The idea is to keep harms beneath a certain level and goods above a certain level. Not to go down too far here, not to go up too far here. Climate change can't go too far, and education, income, peace, and justice can't go too low. This is a much more compelling and engaging conception of a universe that we can live in, a degrowth universe we can live in, than the cliff edges and takeoffs of endless growth and that are given to us by economics and also by the Great Acceleration. However, and here's my conclusion, even this eloquent figure of composition needs to include a recognition, which was the insistence Bruno made throughout his work, and is there in the concept of composition, of its status as a process, as something that needs to be redone over and over again. It needs to compose with other entities and orders, other modes, other ontologies, which it might have overlooked or which might be emerging. And above all, it has to find ways, like the Enzo figure, to acknowledge its own incompleteness, that whatever stability it attains, effort and invention will always need to be renewed to realize its world for the benefit of all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I don't even know where to start, but maybe someone else has a good idea and can do that either in English or in French.
Yes.
Hans-Jörg?
Yeah, I have a very small question. I think Suryo's book, to which you have been referring, has been published in the early 1940s. And the early 1940s and the 1930s as well was a period where the particle sur appeared almost everywhere.
Oh, yeah.
Surrealism, surrationalism
Great.
with Bachelard, and if you look into Bachelard's books on the four elements, you will find multiple versions of this.
Yeah.
So he multiplies even this play and game with the transgressing, or but it has always also something to do with clashing, and this moment of a clash that I had the impression is somehow being lost in compositionism.
That's a fantastic observation. Yeah, those were super decades in spite of everything. They were the decades of the sur, of the taking it to the next level through juxtaposition across massive gaps. Is it possible? And
also doing that with incomparable things. Or
yeah, that's fantastic. And I think that just underlines the point that does sometimes disappear with composition, right? Where everything comes together in this nice, smooth way. That yes, it's always unfinished. That those gaps will stay active. No, thanks for that. Bachelard, surrealism, Surreal are playing a similar game.
Surreal, not surreal.
Déborah?
Yes.
Déborah, tu n'avais pas levé ta main, non? Ah, je t'ai vu. Alors,
There's someone in the back.
Thank you so much, John. I really enjoyed your talk, as always. So I'd just like to react a little since it's kind of my PhD theme. So I'd like to answer actually your questions, the questions you posed, the three questions you posed at the beginning. And I think I kind of agree with your hypothesis, but maybe with a little twist. Like you asked, like, is this a book about compositionism or something like that, right? Like, is it an exercise in compositionism?
Yeah.
And I'll say yes and no. But I'll start with the other questions, because you claim is there a mode, even if you said it's not a yes or no question, I agree. Is there a mode for compositionism? Evidently no, for me. But then you ask, but he also never told us what's the mode for the whole thing he's doing.
Yeah.
And here I disagree with you, because he's very clear, although it's in the 500 pages, it's in just very small sentences, but it's prêt. The prepositional mode,
Yeah.
that's the key to the whole inquiry, which, by the way, is congruent with the fact that in the very late interviews, one of which you quoted, he actually finally defined what is the function of philosophy in his work. And the function of philosophy is exactly the same as prêt, which is to defend against the reduction of plurality or modes of existence. So,
Well, quick answer on that
Yeah.
one. That's extremely helpful. I did think of PRE as a possible reflexive definition of the word, and I agree with you that it's the control, it's the regulating. It's kind of a police function within all the other modes. But I don't think that captures the wish to convene them, to assemble them, to bring them all together.
No, but that's why I'm coming back to the first question through the second and third one. So, is this an exercise in compositionism? No, it is the procedure through anthropological studies so as to come up with a decent and jetable metaphysics, meaning to give a better account, so to bring the ingredients so as to
Eventually.
engage in composition.
Yeah.
So no, it's not an exercise in compositionism, but it's a textbook for the ingredient for compositionism. So,
Thank you very much. I like that a great deal, and I also like that it leaves open I don't think it's slam dunk, what you just said. I think there's also a way of reading it as composition. I mean, the term shows up several times in the book, but not as much as you would think if it was a version of composition. But I think there are two ways we can go on this one. Thanks.
Thank you very much. It was very impressive, the way, and it's funny that you mentioned James at the end, because I had the impression that it was a Jamesian exercise, when in the pragmatism he made all the possibilities to relate the one and the many, and he had several movements there. So I had the impression that you did a little bit the same. It came a little bit to the same idea. And my remark is, I found very impressive to go back to the composition manifesto. So I have 3 questions.
Okay.
The first is it not a project of work learned finally to inhabit a compositionist? Space without nature, a bit what you said. In fact. My second question is about the general movement of the inquiry. I think there is something a little bit missing on what you said, and maybe it's the activity of philosophy, is a diplomacy. And the fact that the tradition of philosophers were diplomats, Leibniz to Latour, for me, and it's the task of philosophy, is a diplomatic version. It's not just an articulation, it's to construct something that will transform the opposition to contrast. This is the diplomatic gesture. And so to transform the opposition to contrast by the invention of a new scene. And all the time, Latour's in the inquiry talk about the diplomatic scene, and that we have to fictionalize a new diplomatic scene. And so that's my second question. And my third one is the surexistence. Maybe I didn't read it well in Souriau, but I think in Souriau it has a very strong moral aspect. It's like if you, by the connection of the multiplicity of modes of existence, put to them to this intensity. It's a culture, it's a moral, and sometimes a very humanist moral. Because a man is more a man when he has several modes of existence, and put this mode of existence to this intensity. And there is all the time in Souriau, I have the impression, research of the unification, the surexistence, the architectonic of the philosophical system, like if something, an entity, would be the most valuable by the possibility to link the multiple. And so what do you do with this?
You kind of are dazed and stunned by it when you read it. I mean, that's what I do with it. You get to the end of that essay and you're like, whoa, what an intense world he's produced, and what outrageous demand he's put on the reader to live it. And I think, yes, there's absolutely this moral, the work of art pushes on you, the world pushes on you to complete it. All of its virtualities are demanding that you realize whatever it is, whatever form it is, a political, artistic, scientific project. And to me that, like, the clear, not to get too like homage, that's not the point, but the huge affection that Latour had for that book helps me understand Latour, right? That I think he felt that sense. There's something wrong. The world is imperfect. There's something out of place. The world is amazing, but it needs to be taken to the next stage. There has to be a new composition. Something greater has to be made out of it, and that's there. As long as I've known it, right? As long as I knew it. So there is this kind of real compulsion. I have to say that I read it at the end of a semester where I was completely burnt out, and I felt like this is not a project that I want to take on. Like this is yes, it's moral, but it's maybe not a moral that I would choose, because there's also something very, again, relentless about it, and it may be the kind of logic of it's not a logic of degrowth. It's a logic of always adding more. So it's a little more this than this.
Yes.
But I completely agree with you. I mean, Beethoven couldn't stop until the symphony was done, and Latour couldn't stop until that next book was out. Your other points, I think, are terrific. I wonder, because diplomacy, why isn't diplomacy a mode? And maybe you guys have an answer for that, but like Stefan has an answer. How that fits within the system, right? That the system is everything, and then there's this additional thing, which is how you use it to create other systems or pacify other systems. And I think it's a great suggestion that Where to Land is a kind of, not a composition manifesto, but a composition landscape in the Suryo sense. I've reassembled things into a new vision of what this world would be like to live in a world with science without nature, where there's no single planet, and yet we're all on territories. Thank you.
But isn't I didn't really put myself on the list just to follow a little follow-up. Isn't the fact that the diplomacy is not a mode, due to the fact, I mean, it's a little bit like the answer you just gave, a little bit due to the fact that you can only start doing diplomacy once you start testing out the inquiry as it stands in 2000 and when was it? 12.
Yeah.
And then diplomacy is something, of course, he wants us to do, which isn't easy at all. But what I find quite funny is that Isabel Fingers also has a whole concept of diplomacy, which he maybe develops a bit more, but then remains quite vague about it also, because I think it's just so difficult to do. I mean, you can go back to Leibniz, you can go back to a lot of things, but to actually do the diplomacy of the inquiry of the modes of existence, or do the diplomacy, if you want to be in Isabel, of the ecology of practices or of cosmopolitics. Yeah. Yes. I don't think you can do it alone, and maybe Latour wasn't megalomaniac enough to think he could do that all by himself and impose the mode, what it should be, and what his criteria and regime of felicity and so on could be. Yeah. I don't know.
No, I agree.
Maybe, I don't know whether anyone else wants to ask something, but one last question, and then we can do the rest in a more less official way.
Yes, thank you very much for this very fascinating and impressive paper. I was wondering, in fact, because multiple ontologies sounds also like or echoed to the debate about multiple modernities, which was very strong 10 years before. And I remember Bruno was also a bit critical against the four ontologies. He never wrote it, but he was at least sometimes a bit fed up about the repetition of the four ontologies as well. And he told me once that he would prefer multinaturalism, which is obviously directly equal to multiple modernity rather than the four ontologies of the Descolian four ontologies. So I would like to, and obviously he moved also on the debate about scale and the debate about the anti-zoom effect. So where he tried also the idea of totality and. So in the same decade, there are a lot of discussion about. I don't know if it has a place in.
Well, and partly these are discussions of globalism. Is there a single system that is globalism? These are 90s and 2000s debates. I think first the kind of fatigue with Descola, or not Descola himself, but I mean with the four ontologies, that it's always these four over and over, and they're these big blocks. That really comes out in the Favorito essay, and there's even like allusions to a fight that they had where one of them slammed the door. But I also think he's giving an answer to say the moderns, I really mean it, it's an unstable assemblage of more than one ontology. Analogy is one of them, which is an extremely mobile ontology, and the naturalist is one, but it's not the only one. I think that's an expression of that. multinaturalism, yeah, that's a term he uses quite a lot, and it kind of captures some of where we are and where to land. And I also think there's a lot to be drawn from the multiple modernities literature. And we heard it this morning, someone talking about modernity and Islamic modernity, right? And those are two quite different ways of working that share a lot of modes, but also assemble as different superexistences, as different assemblies of modes. And those aren't the only two. So that it opens, what I'm thinking about is to bring that kind of perspective in, how they overlap, how they're different, but somehow is there a language to connect and compare. But I think coming back to the diplomat, like it may be necessary that the diplomat be outside, and that the drawing up of these systems is its own kind of thing. Composition is somehow more than the creating of an individual open totality or the juxtaposing of multiple open totalities. So I've learned something. Thank you.
Thank you very much for